There's a verse in the Torah where the Torah tells us, you shall live by my Torah. So the inference of you shall live means not to die for my Torah. So if a person is deathly ill and he has to eat kosher, a person, his life is in jeopardy. He has to violate the Shabbos. Life always supersedes the Torah. However, the times that a Jew has to give his life to sanctify God's name, we explained the three situations for murder, for adultery, incest, and for idolatry. These are the three exceptions. A Jew must give his life to sanctify the Torah. If you give it a choice, bow to the idol or be killed, a Jew has to give his life. Not to do pagan worship. Commit adultery or incest, or we will kill you. You're not permitted, you have to give your life. Kill or be killed, we must give our life. These are the three exceptions, three cardinal sins. However, I mentioned that if there is a decree or decrees which are specifically promulgated to eradicate and uproot Judaism, even for a custom, that's a Jewish custom, that they don't want Jews to identify as Jews any longer, a Jew has to give his life. That's considered to sanctify God's name, to give your life. There's nothing more precious to a human being than his life. So by giving your life, it's the ultimate level of sacrifice and service, which declares and states clearly that I live for God, and therefore if it's a question of it's my life or God's glory, I give my life for the sake of God's glory. That's known as Kiddush Hashem. What about if a person has in mind that theoretically speaking, if in fact the situation should arise that you're confronted with this decision, and you will give your life if it should present itself. What is the value of that mental commitment, emotional mental commitment that you would give your life? Is that the equivalent of actually giving your life? Well, no, it's just a thought. It shows a degree of service, but it's all theoretical. Does it have a semblance of giving your life to sanctify God's name? There's a Zohar cites a verse from Tehillim where David says, Olecha horagnu kol hayom. For you, we are murdered every day. It's a simple understanding means that throughout history, the Jews were always murdered and killed because we were Jews. We didn't have much choice in the matter. But the Zohar explains, this is Reb Shimi Yochai explains, Olechno ragnu kol hayom, that a Jew is able to die multiple times in a lifetime, or even every day, if you have in mind that if the scenario should present itself, or the situation where you're confronted with a decision, either live or die for the sake of God, and you are mentally committed that if it should present itself, you will give your life, God values that mental commitment as if you gave your life. And that's what David means, Olecha horagnu kol hayom. For you, we are murdered every day. That if that situation should present itself, I'm willing to endure that, even though it means forfeiture of my life. That's the Zohar. So I'll give you an example where if you think this, we say in the Shema, you must love God to what extent? With all your heart. What does it mean, even if it means giving your life? If you're confronted with a situation and you give an ultimatum, either do idolatry or, like Avram was given the choice, either bow to the idol, you go into the kiln. So if you go into the kiln, there's no question you've given your life. What about you were never confronted with that ultimatum, but you have in mind that if it should present itself, you would? Is your account accredited as if you gave your life? So based on the Zohar, it is. And the Ramchal speaks about this here regarding the Shema, that although it's not quite exactly as giving your life, but it has a semblance of that. And God values that to the greatest degree. So on your account, you could have endless times where, in fact, you've given your life, although it's not exactly, but it has a semblance of that. And the value of that is tremendous value. I always say, we know Rabbi Akiva was of the greatest Torah sages of the Tanoic period. And he was one of the 10 martyrs. And the Romans had decreed that nobody's permitted to teach Torah in public. Rabbi Akiva defied that decree, and he was put to death. And they tortured him to death. They scathed the flesh off his body. The Romans were such barbarians, and they sold his flesh in the meat market. Human flesh. Rabbi Akiva, as he was being killed and butchered, his students surrounded him and witnessed this, and they were wailing and crying, seeing their Rebbe being put to death in such a manner. So he says to his students, you don't realize, I've waited for this moment all my life, that God should present me with this challenge. And now that I have this challenge and I'm meeting the challenge, it's not a time to cry. I feel this is the moment of opportunity, that I'm showing at that special level my love for God, that I'm giving what's most precious to me, my life, to God. This is what he said to the students. So the question is, why did Rabbi Akiva see it the way he saw it? And the students were crying. He says there's no reason to cry. The students themselves, what was their source of Torah knowledge? Rabbi Akiva. Once that's denied to them, they're left bereft, devoid of that endless source of knowledge, of holiness. Therefore, they were looking at themselves. What would they be left as? Orphaned beyond being orphaned. Rabbi Akiva, he looked at it as what? He's the beneficiary of this. That Hashem presented him with this opportunity to demonstrate his unlimited love for God, to give his life, this is the ultimate opportunity. Now, it's interesting. Rabbi Akiva, when the Talmud describes his level of genius, even among his colleagues, he's referred to as Oker Horim v'tochen zu b'zu. He uprooted mountains and he would grind them together. That was the degree of his genius, at the equivalent of uprooting mountains and pulverizing them. A man of Rabbi Akiva's caliber and dimension of Torah knowledge. What was the value of 1 hour of Torah study or his dissemination of Torah? You could take our whole generation, combine it, it does not come to 1 moment or 1 hour of Rabbi Akiva's dissemination of Torah. When Rabbi Akiva was giving up his life, what was he giving up? He wasn't giving up a physical life. He was giving up a value that every moment has infinite value. And God says, as much as that's infinite, and Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam, and that is the source of our lifeline, our connection to God, which is the Torah, to sanctify my name, you give it up. Because a person could enter into a little bit of a quandary. Would it make more sense to hold back and continue? Rabbi Akiva says, if God says, regardless of your dimension of being, you must give your life, evidently the value of that is greater than whatever the value of your dissemination of Torah is. So Rabbi Akiva being presented with this issue over here, he says, this is the moment of my ecstasy. This is the ultimate moment. So the greater you are, the greater innate value that mitzvah has. A person is worth very little. Man doesn't study, doesn't earn a living, nothing. He's not a contribution at any level to himself, not to society. And he gives his life. He's not giving up very much other than his life. But a man who possesses such a level of knowledge, a degree of influence, which is unparalleled, and he understands what his value is, and despite that, he gives it all up to sanctify God's name, the level of sanctification is the greatest sanctification, because he knows what he's giving up, and despite that, God's glory has greater value than whatever he's worth. I just saw recently from Rav Chaim Volozhiner in his commentary on Pirkei Avos, the Talmud tells us that to be a prophet, you have to have a number of characteristics, attributes. You have to have wisdom, you have to have wealth, you have to have power, and you must be humble. Must be humble. So he goes to explain, if humility is the ultimate attribute, a negation to God, so the man who doesn't have the wealth, doesn't have the power, doesn't have the knowledge, why can't he be worthy of prophecy? Because he's so humble. So he goes to explain, a person doesn't have much to show for his life. You have no recognition, no accomplish nothing. And you feel humble. Well, what do you have to pride yourself? So their humility really doesn't have much value. Humility is when you have everything to pride yourself, wisdom, wealth, power. And despite that, you don't attribute that to yourself. That's true humility. So therefore it says to merit God's communicating with you. Prophecy, if you have all those qualities, and despite that, you don't get tied up and consumed with your own glory, and you negate yourself to God, that's true humility. But a person who has nothing to show for his life and he's humble, it's understood he's humble. You have nothing to show for your life. Rebbe Kiva understood what he was. He had 24,000 students who passed away in the 34-day period. He was the greatest Torah sage. As I said, his value was, we can't relate to what his value was. And he gave his life. And because God says, give you a life. What is he giving up? He's giving up more than anybody ever gave up within that era. Therefore, it's a greater sanctification of God's name. So a person of such stature, when he would think throughout the day multiple times, if the scenario would present itself, that it be confronted to live or die for the sake of God, and I would choose to give my life, the greater your life is, the greater innate value, the greater level of your accomplishment is, the greater is the result of that mental commitment that if it should present itself, you will give your life. And it's cited in the Zohar when you say, B'chol nafshecha, you must love God with all your soul, meaning with all your life. You're supposed to think at that time, if it should present itself, and I'm confronted with a decision to live or die, you're supposed to envision in your mind some level of death penalty that you will experience it despite the degree of pain or level of inhumanity that will be applied to you. And you could have multiple things in mind. You'll be thrown off a cliff. You'll be crushed. You'll be thrown into a fire. You'll be drowned. You'll be shot. You'll be mutilated. Whatever it is. But again, if you have that in mind, God values it with a semblance as if you gave your life. We've mentioned, the Navi says, what is the value of creation? Why did God create this world? For his glory. God needs no glory. But what it means that if you recognize his glory, that he is the master, he is the provider, he is the endower, You recognize that, then you're worthy of a relationship. If you don't recognize that, and recognition doesn't mean to say just verbal recognition and you live your life as you choose, but rather, as they say, you put your money where your mouth is. And you just don't talk the talk, but you walk the walk. And you actually actualize God's will by integrating it into your life. What does that say? I live my life for God's glory. Although I have choice, I could do differently. I choose to invest it for God's glory because I recognize that's what it's all about. So what are you doing when you do that? It's actually you're acknowledging God as the master. Every person is a master. If we could choose as we choose to choose, and yet we subordinate ourselves to the will of God, what does that say? Who's the master? God's the master, you're not the master. So it's very interesting. Let's say a person keeps the Noahide laws because he's a humanitarian. You know, it's like a conscientious objector. He doesn't go to war. Has nothing to do with God. It's just in good conscience, he can't do it. I'm a humanitarian. I don't kill. I don't eat limbs off living animals. I don't steal. I don't blaspheme. I'm a refined person. That non-Jew has no share in the world to come. Because the basis for his quality of life and standard is unrelated to God. Even the non-Jew could have a share in the world to come. He's identified as the righteous Gentiles. That's the person who keeps, observes, and is committed to the 7 Noahide laws. What are 7 Noahide laws? To be a humanitarian. That through accepting these laws, you're demonstrating that you're subordinating yourself to God as the king, as God as the master. But if you're doing it for your own vantage point, unrelated to God, you have no relevance to God. That person has no share in the world to come. The Shema is accepting the yoke of heaven upon yourself. That declaration, which we haven't gotten into the details of it, the various appellations we refer to God, Hashem, Elokeinu, Echad, what with the significance of each of these words. But conceptually speaking, what are we doing? We're acknowledging God as our master. That's the declaration. Master means you're the master. We're subordinated to your will. We submit to your will, even to die, even to give it all up. That's a true position of a servant to a master. And that's the purpose of creation. The world will only achieve its level of perfection only if humanity recognizes who the master is and who they are. Why is humility such a vital characteristic and attribute that a person must assume? A humble posture. We speak about Avram Avinu, the students of Avram and the students of Bilam. He was shval ruach. He had ruach nemucha, a low spirit, meaning he wasn't looking for the glory. No self-glory. What is that all about? Why is that such a valuable attribute? Humility. The Rambam writes that there's a mitzvah of Avas Hashem. You must love God. There's a mitzvah of V'ahavta l'recha kamocha. You must love your fellow. Love is not a concept. Love is a reality. Love is an emotion. Either you love or you don't love. A person, whether he wants to observe the Shabbos or not, you could be fully committed to the observance of the Shabbos because we can control our behavior. Dietary laws, tefillin, tzitzis, whatever, charity. But love is something either you feel it or you don't feel it. So how do you somehow activate your emotion, the mind emotion, to have that level of love for anybody or for God? This question is posed by Rambam. And Rambam explains or love your fellow. We're speaking about a person who believes in God. And you believe God is the creator of this universe. And you look at the sunrise, and you look at the sunset, and you look at the mountain range, and you look at vegetation, you look at the oceans, and you look at the vastness of this existence, terrestrial, celestial, and you take it all in. What do you see? You're amazed. You're overwhelmed. If you ever see a picture of the tsunami coming in, the power of the ocean, it's not to be believed. And it's meaningless. We're talking about a person who believes in God. That's only God is willing that should happen. It's meaningless. So if that's meaningless, and the all existence is so awe-inspiring and overwhelmingly beyond impressive at every level, genius, beauty, balance, function, what do you feel? In the presence of God, once you touched and you're impressed with all this, how do you rate? The word rate has no relevance to the vocabulary. You're less than infinitesimal. So Rambam writes, when you look at creation and you're overwhelmed with God's genius, when you see and you understand this is God's creation, what happens to the person? You're immediately negated. You're reduced to non-existent state. And when you're negated to that level, immediately evokes a desire and a love to be associated with this being. Now, there's an expression. You have a rabbi, tremendous Talmud Chacham, not using the word Torah scholar. Genius, delivery. So you ask a person who came to the lecture or the halachic discourse, say, what do you think? Wasn't impressed. Somebody, not impressed. Why aren't you impressed? Because he wasn't wearing a kippah sruga. If he would have worn a kippah sruga, then I would have been impressed. But you missed the boat. You know? You have Queen Elizabeth III, which was never built, or the Titanic, which was recreated. It doesn't have your initial embossed on the side of the boat. You know, I'm not impressed. You know something? As it says, I don't know when you were born, if you were born, or maybe they left intelligence out of your skull. What do you mean you're not impressed? How can you not be impressed? You have to be so consumed with your own nonsense and stupidity. The word not seeing the forest from the trees is an understatement. You missed the boat, period. So if a person sees it, even to some degree, you negate it. Once you're negated, then you're able to see God. You remove all the membranes, the cataract from that healthy eye, and you see it right. The way God created a human being, when you appreciate someone outside to be special and unique and exceptional, you gravitate towards that person or towards that entity, and you want to become part of it. But what is the blockage? The blockage is the lack of humility. But once you're negated and you're humbled, then you see it clearly. The other person, he's not impressed because he's too preoccupied with himself. To be impressed, you have to speak his language, meaning he sees you as a financial opportunity or as an ego stroker or an ego inflator or whatever you want to call him. That's my kind of person. But a person who's truly quality at the ultimate level, not impressed. But if you are negated, now you understand what's there to be impressed with. You may have people of a certain caliber, doctors, intellectuals. They're impressed with the makeup of the human body, the pathology, the internal organs, the function, the chemistry. And you have this farmer who plants tubers in the ground. That's about all he knows. And knows how to turn on the tractor and fill it up with diesel gas. And he says, and all the doctors are speaking, they're amazed. There's a conference, medical conference, they're speaking about new discoveries, new innovations, and they realize they can outpace whatever the body naturally is, its normal function. And he says, I know what all these guys are impressed with. They should come to my farm and see the way that tuber grows in the ground. They'll be impressed with that. No, this guy, his 10-gallon hat is not big enough. It should have been big enough that his whole body should fit into it. That's how out of touch he is with reality. That's the value of humility. Avram's, one of his attributes was ruch nemucha. He had a low spirit. He wasn't high-spirited. Some people, they go 1,000 RPMs a minute or a second. You know what it's called? That's called spinning out of control. That's what it's called. So all there, Kriya Shema, accepting the yoke of heaven, acknowledging who the master is, to the point that you're willing to give your life for him, to give up all your possessions for him, that your heart should be dedicated to him. What is that saying? You are what it's all about. We are only here to serve. But it doesn't make sense. Give up your life, give up your success, give up everything you stand for. It depends where you begin. But if that is my purpose, why I was put on this earth, on this forsaken earth, it's forsaken unless it has that special value. So why does it make any sense? It makes plenty of sense. A person hires a singer to entertain him, and this person's paid a fortune for that service. And this person sings all day to entertain the person who pays him. Somebody says, what are you doing here? He says, I sing to entertain this man. Is that what you're doing? You're wasting your life. He says, I'm wasting my life. Do you know what this man pays me? I make more than you make in a year in one day. How am I wasting my time? How do you give it all away? But I was only endowed with my ability, and whatever I have is only for that purpose. That's exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. So the question is, where do we start? If that's what I'm supposed to be doing, it makes sense. And ultimately, and if you succeed and understand that, then you score at a level which is not fathomable. And that's what we talk about the world to come. We talk about having a relation with God, eternal relation with God, which is perfect on the absolute level. And that is the declaration of the Shema. I declare with absolute belief my level of understanding who God is within my limited capacity, to acknowledge him to be the master at every level, with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your possessions, to speak his Torah. What about my Torah? Why only his Torah? Because that's the only way, you have a lifeline and you take hold of it, you remain alive. Person says, what do I have to take hold of the lifeline? What about the straws that are floating on the water? Why can't I grab onto that and not sink and not drown? The answer is, of course, that's called grasping at straws. That's not reality. Reality is the lifeline. If it's connected to something which is secure, then you can be pulled out of the brink. Otherwise, you drown. And that's what life is. The world itself is, I don't want to use the word, a cesspool, a spiritual cesspool. It's definitely a level of turmoil, confusion, that unless you have the super computer to make some semblance of sanity out of it, you can't figure it out. It's going in every direction simultaneously. Up, down, sideways, diagonally, whatever it is. Ready to spin it's out of control, spin out of existence. That's the rate that this world is going. You say, where am I? What am I doing here? No. You know what the challenge is? Despite that, to see it right. If that is your conclusion and that is your result, then you're a superhero. And then you have a relationship, and you're worthy of a relationship because you recognize your purpose and your value, and you fully invested it as you were supposed to invest it. So the purpose of existence is to acknowledge who the master is. It's for God's glory. God doesn't need glory. But if you want to have a relationship with him to be a beneficiary of his glory, you have to recognize him to be the master. And by you being the subject, that sets him as the master.